Fragmented picked captures recovered from long-range auger sweeps show planetary surfaces marked by geometric scarring, inconsistent with known Imperial macroengineering. Vast planar depressions, angular protrusions, and symmetrical fault lines appear beneath layers of ash, regolith, or vitrified sand. In several instances, these formations were initially catalogued as tectonic anomalies or pre-Imperial megastructural ruins of unknown origin. Subsequent surveys corrected this assumption when subsurface Auspex readings detected power signatures dormant yet intact, registering energy harmonics not aligned with any standard template construct derivative. Explorator teams reported a recurring pattern. Worlds previously classified as dead or marginal, lacking significant biospheres and dismissed as strategically irrelevant, exhibited identical internal mass distributions. Hollow strata replaced expected planetary cores. Cavernous voids extended for thousands of kilometers beneath crustal layers, arranged with deliberate symmetry rather than natural erosion. These findings were often accompanied by sensor interference, including time-lag distortions in picked feeds, data corruption localized to specific coordinates, and unexplained machine spirit errors across multiple Auspex platforms. Eyewitness testimonies from sanctioned surveyors and rogue traders speak of identical impressions: silent horizons, absence of atmospheric movement despite measurable wind vectors, metallic structures emerging from bedrock without visible seams or signs of construction. In some cases, excavation teams recorded contact losses within minutes of breaching subterranean access points. Vox traffic degraded into rhythmic static before terminating entirely. No bodies were recovered. Recovered logs indicate that many of these sites were initially investigated independently, without centralized recognition of their shared characteristics. It was only after millennia of fragmented reports, redacted explorator notes, and sealed administratum addenda that a broader pattern emerged. Worlds once marked as inert were reclassified under restricted threat indices. Cartographic annotations were quietly amended. Several star charts were altered entirely, excising system data under the justification of navigational error. Within the first 200 words of consolidated cross-sector analysis, a singular designation began to appear in restricted archival margins, applied retroactively to hundreds of such locations across the galaxy. The term was not descriptive but categorical, implying function rather than geography, and origin rather than condition. These locations are not colonies in the Imperial sense, nor ruins of extinct civilizations in the conventional archaeological framework. They are planetary-scale containment systems, constructed with deliberate intent to endure geological time without maintenance or oversight. Each tomb world functions as both vault and fortress, preserving an entire civilization in a state neither alive nor dead by Imperial biological standards. Their surfaces are often barren by design, engineered to discourage settlement or exploration while concealing extensive subterranean infrastructures. Discovery of tomb worlds has occurred sporadically since the early millennia of Imperial expansion, though reliable identification only became possible after repeated hostile encounters. Initial contact narratives described tomb worlds as inactive until external disturbance triggered defensive protocols. In these early cases, planetary populations were eradicated with mechanical efficiency before Imperial authorities could issue sector-wide alerts. Later discoveries benefited from these losses, though knowledge remained tightly controlled. Inhabitants of tomb worlds are not born, recruited, or trained. They are preserved. Each world houses vast necropolises populated by Necron constructs, once living beings of the Necrontyr species who underwent biotransference during the War in Heaven. Their physical forms are composed of necrodermis, a self-repairing living metal capable of reconfiguration and regeneration under extreme damage. These entities do not age, do not reproduce, and do not experience biological death in any recognized sense. Necron populations are arranged in hierarchical dynastic structures, preserved exactly as they existed prior to stasis. At the apex are the ruling pharaons or overlords, each retaining individual identity, memory, and strategic autonomy. Beneath them exist lords, cryptex, and specialized castes responsible for warfare, science, and maintenance. Lower tiers consist of warriors and automatons with limited cognitive function, deployed in overwhelming numbers during planetary activation events. The stasis technology employed within Tomb Worlds surpasses all known Imperial cryogenic systems. Temporal suspension fields isolate inhabitants from entropy, allowing millions of years to pass without degradation. Reactivation sequences are automated yet adaptive, capable of responding to environmental changes, planetary shifts, or external intrusion. In many cases, Tomb Worlds awaken gradually, with localized sectors activating independently before full planetary mobilization occurs. Surface populations encountered prior to awakening vary widely. Some Tomb Worlds were colonized unknowingly by Imperial settlers during early expansion eras, their inhabitants building cities atop dormant necropolises. Others remained uninhabited, their hostile environments discouraging long-term settlement. In rare cases, Xenos species established civilizations on these worlds, often exterminated during initial Necron reawakening phases. Records indicate that such eradications are executed without negotiation or deviation, suggesting pre-programmed threat elimination protocols rather than strategic necessity. Physical descriptions of Necron entities are remarkably consistent across encounters. Typical warrior constructs stand approximately 2 meters in height, with skeletal frames composed of segmented necrodermis plates. Ocular units emit a steady green luminescence, though variations have been documented among different dynasties. Limbs are elongated, optimized for mechanical efficiency rather than humanoid ergonomics. Facial structures retain stylized skull-like features, an intentional design choice reflecting Necrontyr cultural fixation on mortality. Higher-ranking Necrons exhibit more elaborate forms. Lords and overlords possess reinforced frames, ornamented with dynastic glyphs and metallic crests. Their necrodermis composition is denser, granting enhanced resilience and regenerative capacity. Crypts, the scientific caste, often display asymmetrical augmentations, integrated energy conduits, and reality-manipulating devices beyond Imperial comprehension. These modifications are not standardized, reflecting individual specialization rather than mass production. Despite their mechanical appearance, Necron inhabitants retain varying degrees of personality and memory. Ruling castes demonstrate strategic foresight, emotional responses such as pride or contempt, and long-term planning capabilities spanning millennia. Lower castes operate under strict command hierarchies, exhibiting limited autonomy. This stratification mirrors the rigid social structures of the ancient Necrontyr civilization, preserved without alteration. The awakening of a tomb world is not a singular event, but a phased process. Initial reactivation often involves automated defense systems, including surface pylons, energy obelisks, and scarab constructs tasked with reconnaissance and repair. These systems operate silently, restoring infrastructure and assessing planetary conditions before larger forces emerge. Only after threat evaluation does mass awakening commence, deploying warrior legions and command element. Imperial attempts to classify tomb worlds as purely military installations have proven inadequate. These planets function as cultural repositories, strategic bastions, and population vaults simultaneously. They are not abandoned relics, but active components of a galactic-scale reclamation effort undertaken by a civilization older than humanity itself. Each tomb world represents a foothold, patiently waiting for conditions deemed optimal by entities unconcerned with biological timelines. In several documented cases, tomb worlds failed to awaken correctly. Damage sustained during orbital bombardment, tectonic instability, or prior Xenos interference disrupted stasis protocols. Such worlds often produce erratic activation patterns, releasing partially functional Necron forces or corrupted constructs exhibiting unpredictable behavior. These anomalies are of particular interest to the Adeptus Mechanicus, though access remains heavily restricted. It is worth noting that not all tomb worlds are fully catalogued, nor are all catalogued worlds accurately understood. Some remain entirely dormant, their activation conditions unknown. Others have awakened, engaged Imperial forces, and then returned to stasis without explanation. A minority have been deliberately destroyed at extreme cost, though complete neutralization is rare and often temporary. The defining characteristic of tomb worlds is not their hostility but their patience. They do not expand, negotiate, or warn. They endure. Their inhabitants do not seek conquest in the conventional sense but reclamation, operating under strategic objectives established before the rise of the Imperium. To encounter a tomb world is not to discover a lost civilization, but to intrude upon one that never left. The surface environments of Necron Tomb Worlds are not incidental outcomes of time or neglect. In most recorded cases, planetary conditions reflect deliberate engineering choices made to preserve subterranean integrity and discourage long-term surface habitation. Geography, climate, and biological presence are shaped either through ancient terraforming, sustained stasis maintenance, or controlled planetary decay. What appears barren or hostile is often functional rather than accidental. Geographically, tomb worlds exhibit unusually stable crustal structures. Tectonic activity is either heavily suppressed or channeled along predictable fault lines that avoid core necropolis zones. Seismic scans consistently show reinforced mantle layers beneath major tomb complexes, composed of materials unknown to Imperial geology. These layers absorb or redistribute planetary stress, preventing collapse even after millions of years. As a result, mountain ranges, continental shelves, and ocean basins often appear geologically stagnant, lacking the erosion patterns expected of worlds of comparable age. Surface terrain varies significantly between tomb worlds but follows recurring archetypes. Many are arid or semi-arid planets dominated by deserts, salt flats, and vitrified plains. These environments reduce biological activity and limit chemical corrosion, preserving surface structures that serve as access points, energy conduits, or sensory arrays. In some instances, deserts are not natural, but the result of atmospheric thinning executed during the world's preparation phase, long before Necron stasis commenced. Other tomb worlds present frozen surfaces. Permafrost layers several kilometers thick encase the crust, locking geological processes in near stasis. Ice coverage acts as a natural radiation shield and stabilizes surface temperatures, preventing thermal expansion that could compromise buried systems. These worlds often exhibit auroral phenomena caused by artificial magnetospheres interacting with stellar radiation, though no weather systems develop in the conventional sense. Oceanic tomb worlds are rare but documented. In these cases, vast seas conceal continental plates beneath which necropolises are anchored. The oceans themselves are often shallow, chemically inert, and biologically sparse. Salinity levels tend toward extremes, discouraging complex life. Tidal behavior is tightly regulated, suggesting orbital adjustments or gravity manipulation in the distant past. These seas function less as ecosystems and more as protective barriers. Meteorological conditions on tomb worlds are similarly constrained. Weather patterns, where present, are predictable to an unnatural degree. Wind currents follow consistent vectors, storm systems repeat on fixed cycles, and atmospheric pressure remains within narrow tolerances. This stability benefits long-term preservation and minimizes environmental unpredictability during reawakening phases. On desert tomb worlds, sandstorms are common but highly localized, often forming around geometric features or subsurface energy nodes. Analysis suggests these storms are influenced by residual energy emissions rather than natural convection. Dust particles frequently contain trace metallic elements not native to the planetary crust, likely shed from surface constructs over millennia. Frozen tomb worlds experience minimal precipitation. Snowfall, when it occurs, is composed of fine crystalline particulates rather than conventional ice flakes. Atmospheric moisture content remains low, preventing ice buildup on exposed Necron structures. Temperature fluctuations are shallow, with diurnal cycles dampened by artificial thermal regulation embedded deep within the crust. Atmospheric composition across tomb worlds often deviates subtly from Imperial norms. Oxygen levels may be marginally insufficient for sustained human activity, or trace gases may interfere with respiration and cognitive function. These deviations are rarely lethal immediately but contribute to long-term habitation failure. Explorator logs note increased fatigue, hallucinations, and time perception distortion after prolonged exposure, though causation remains unconfirmed. Flora on Tomb Worlds is minimal by design. Where plant life exists, it is typically hardy, low growth, and slow reproducing. Lichens, fungal mats, and sparse scrub vegetation dominate. These organisms anchor soil layers, preventing erosion that could expose underlying structures prematurely. In some cases, flora appears genetically engineered to tolerate high radiation or metallic soil content, though whether this engineering predates Necron occupation or resulted from later contamination is disputed. No native flora has been conclusively identified as Necron-created, yet the absence of invasive growth across millennia suggests active environmental suppression. Root systems rarely penetrate beyond shallow depths, avoiding interference with subsurface systems. Photosynthetic activity is limited, keeping atmospheric oxygen levels stable but low. Faunal presence is similarly constrained. Indigenous animal life, when present, tends towards small, resilient species with low metabolic demands. Burrowing creatures are rare to non-existent, likely due to subterranean energy fields or geological reinforcement layers that discourage tunneling. Larger predators are almost entirely absent, suggesting either deliberate eradication or environmental incompatibility. On some tomb worlds, fauna exhibits anomalous behavior. Animals avoid specific regions without visible stimuli, altering migration paths or nesting patterns to circumvent tomb complexes. This avoidance persists even when such routes increase exposure to predators or harsh conditions. The phenomenon is attributed to low-level energy emissions detectable by non-human sensory systems. In several recorded instances, fauna introduced through later colonization failed to establish stable populations. Livestock perished within generations, suffering from sterility, developmental abnormalities, or unexplained mortality. Wild species released for ecological balance similarly declined. These failures reinforced the classification of such worlds as unsuitable for long-term habitation, often before their true nature was understood. One notable exception involves tomb worlds that remained active rather than fully dormant. On these planets, Necron maintenance constructs periodically surface, altering terrain, repairing erosion, or dismantling emerging ecosystems. Scarab swarms are frequently observed consuming organic material, reducing biomass to elemental components. These actions are not aggressive but methodical, restoring planetary conditions to predefined baselines. Like conditions on tomb worlds are also distinctive. Many exhibit muted surface illumination due to atmospheric particulates or orbital positioning. Day-night cycles may be extended or irregular, resulting in prolonged twilight conditions. In certain regions, ambient green luminescence emanates from subsurface energy conduits, visible through translucent rock or sand. This light does not fluctuate with stellar cycles and persists even during eclipses. Soundscapes on tomb worlds are notably subdued. Wind produces minimal noise, and seismic activity is rare. Explorators report an oppressive silence broken only by mechanical resonance detected through auspex rather than audible sound. In active regions, low-frequency vibrations are felt rather than heard, suggesting deep energy transmission rather than surface movement. Olfactory reports are inconsistent but often describe metallic or ozone-like scents, particularly near excavation sites. These odours intensify during activation events, coinciding with increased electromagnetic output. Taste and tactile sensations are similarly affected, with water sources exhibiting metallic aftertaste and surfaces maintaining unnatural thermal neutrality, regardless of ambient temperature. From an environmental logistics perspective, tomb worlds are remarkably efficient. Minimal biological activity reduces entropy and maintenance requirements. Predictable weather minimizes structural stress. Suppressed tectonics preserve alignment of subterranean complexes. Every environmental factor contributes to long-term stability rather than habitability. Importantly, not all tomb worlds are uniformly hostile. Some were deliberately left marginally habitable to serve as lures or buffers. Imperial settlers unknowingly established populations, providing energy, labour or strategic distraction during awakening phases. In these cases, ecosystems appeared functional until activation sequences disrupted climate regulation or released automated cleansing protocols. The relationship between Necron technology and planetary environments suggests mastery over geoengineering at a scale the Imperium cannot replicate. These worlds are not merely occupied, but integrated. Their geographies shaped as extensions of Necron infrastructure. Mountains function as shielding, deserts as concealment, ice caps as insulation, oceans as barriers. Chapter 1. Part 2 establishes that the landscapes of tomb worlds are not passive backdrops to Necron presence. They are components of a planetary system optimized for preservation, concealment, and eventual reactivation. Flora and fauna persist only where tolerated. Weather exists only where controlled. Geography itself becomes an instrument, ensuring that when the tomb world awakens, it does so from a position of environmental dominance rather than adaptation. When viewed holistically, tomb worlds are less planets than mechanisms, their surfaces calibrated to protect what lies beneath until the moment of return. Key events associated with Necron Tomb Worlds are rarely isolated incidents. They unfold as sequences of escalation, often beginning decades or centuries before open conflict is recognized. The earliest phase is almost always misinterpretation. Imperial surveyors, rogue traders, or colonization fleets classify the world as marginal but viable. Settlement proceeds slowly, constrained by environmental hostility but encouraged by long-term projections. Mining outposts, research enclaves, or hive foundations are established, frequently atop regions later identified as dormant tomb complexes. The first recorded irregularities tend to be logistical rather than overtly hostile. Power fluctuations affect settlements without corresponding damage to infrastructure. Machinery experiences unexplained synchronization errors. Chronometric instruments lose accuracy. These anomalies are initially attributed to environmental interference, substandard equipment, or human error. Administratum records show repeated requests for replacement machinery and revised atmospheric tolerances, none of which resolve the underlying issues. As population density increases or excavation efforts deepen, incidents escalate. Mining shafts collapse without seismic cause. Survey teams disappear after breaching sealed strata composed of unfamiliar alloys. Automated defense drones, long dormant, activate briefly and then retreat. In several documented cases, settlers report sightings of metallic figures at extreme distances, motionless and unresponsive, vanishing when approached. These accounts are often dismissed or redacted to prevent panic. The activation threshold varies between tomb worlds. Some respond immediately to subsurface intrusion. Others remain inert until planetary population reaches a critical mass. This suggests that tomb worlds are equipped with adaptive monitoring systems capable of evaluating threat levels over extended timescales. The intent is not immediate extermination, but controlled response. The first overt activation event is typically localized. A single tomb complex awakens beneath a settlement or excavation zone. Necron warriors emerge in limited numbers, neutralizing nearby threats with precision. Energy weapons disintegrate targets without collateral damage. Structures collapse not from bombardment, but from deliberate undermining of load-bearing points. Survivors report mechanical forces advancing without vocalization, unaffected by small arms fire. Imperial response is usually delayed. Initial distress calls are fragmented or censored by planetary authorities unwilling to acknowledge loss of control. When Astra Militarum forces arrive, they encounter resistance that defies conventional engagement doctrine. Enemy units self-repair, destroyed constructs reassemble, command elements teleport rather than advance. Casualty ratios become unsustainable within days. At this stage, several outcomes are possible, depending on strategic value and timing. In some cases, exterminatus is authorized. Virus bombing, cyclonic torpedoes, or sustained orbital bombardment are deployed to deny the Necron's full planetary reactivation. These measures are inconsistently effective. While surface populations are eradicated, subterranean tomb networks often survive, shielded by phase-shifted materials and energy-dampening fields. Such worlds may return to dormancy after the assault, only partially damaged and still occupied. Other tomb worlds are subjected to prolonged conflict. Imperial forces establish orbital blockades, attempting containment rather than destruction. These campaigns often span decades, draining resources while achieving minimal territorial gain. Necron forces withdraw and re-emerge unpredictably, striking infrastructure and retreating underground. Over time, Imperial presence erodes until withdrawal becomes inevitable. A third outcome involves complete Necron reawakening. In these events, the tomb world activates in full. Planetary pylons rise from the crust. Atmospheric manipulation intensifies. Tomb ships emerge from concealed docks. Necron command structures deploy at scale. Surface settlements are eliminated systematically. Resistance collapses within months or even weeks. Afterward, the world is rendered lifeless by Imperial biological standards. Key historical examples reinforce this pattern. The reawakening of the world, designated Sanctuary 101, resulted in the loss of 3 Imperial hive cities within a single standard year. Prior to activation, the planet supported a population exceeding 8 billion. Post-conflict surveys detected no organic life beyond microbial remnants. Orbital scans confirmed extensive surface restructuring consistent with Necron geoengineering. The planet remains under Necron control, its status listed as forbidden. In contrast, some tomb worlds are never reclaimed by the Necrons. These worlds suffer catastrophic damage during early awakening attempts. Orbital bombardment fractures crustal stability. Stasis fields fail unevenly, releasing corrupted constructs incapable of coordination. Such worlds become dead zones, haunted by malfunctioning Necron remnants and environmental hazards. They are rarely resettled and often quarantined indefinitely. Cities built atop tomb worlds fare poorly regardless of outcome. Even when Necron forces are repelled or destroyed, underlying infrastructure contamination renders long-term habitation impossible. Radiation spikes, phase instability zones, and lingering energy emissions degrade biological viability. Administratum doctrine mandates abandonment rather than reconstruction in most cases. The final fate of a tomb world depends less on Imperial intervention and more on Necron strategic priorities. Some worlds are reclaimed fully, becoming active dynastic capitals or military staging grounds. Others are resealed, returning to dormancy once external threats are eliminated. A minority are intentionally sacrificed, used to delay or distract Imperial forces while more valuable worlds awaken elsewhere. Importantly, not all tomb worlds awaken violently. Several documented cases indicate negotiated or delayed activation, though details remain heavily censored. In these instances, Necron forces emerge briefly to secure specific artifacts or objectives, then withdraw. Planetary populations are spared temporarily, only to be abandoned later by Imperial authorities once the threat is recognized. The long-term impact of tomb world encounters extends beyond individual planets. Each awakening event forces re-evaluation of star charts, trade routes, and colonization priorities. Entire sectors are reclassified as high risk. Imperial expansion slows. Resources are diverted from growth to containment. The psychological effect on frontier populations is significant, though rarely acknowledged in official records. From a strategic perspective, tomb worlds represent persistent denial zones. They cannot be reliably destroyed, occupied, or neutralized. Even when rendered inert, the possibility of reactivation remains. This uncertainty shapes Imperial doctrine, favoring avoidance over engagement whenever possible. The fate of the tomb world itself is never truly final. Destruction of surface layers does not equate to elimination. Dormancy does not imply abandonment. Even worlds reduced to molten crusts may conceal intact vaults beneath the mantle. Time, from the Necron perspective, is not an adversary. Cities, civilizations, and ecosystems that arise on these worlds are transient variables. Their rise and fall are statistically insignificant within Necron planning horizons. What matters is structural integrity, strategic position, and eventual readiness. Necron Tomb Worlds are not relics awaiting rediscovery. They are latent powers embedded within the galaxy, activating according to criteria humanity does not fully understand and cannot meaningfully influence. Their key events are not isolated catastrophes, but predictable consequences of intrusion. Their final fate is never closure, only transition. A tomb world does not end. It either awakens, waits, or withdraws. The planet may burn, freeze, or fracture, but the presence beneath endures. For the Imperium, the only certainty is that discovery marks the beginning of loss, not knowledge. From the standpoint of the Adeptus Administratum, Necron Tomb Worlds are not first classified as existential threats, but as bureaucratic anomalies. Initial impressions are formed through data inconsistency rather than hostile contact. Survey logs conflict with follow-up reports. Planetary tithe projections fail to align with population growth models. Environmental assessments contradict long-term stability forecasts. These discrepancies trigger administrative scrutiny long before military or theological concern is raised. The earliest administratum engagement with a suspected tomb world occurs at the level of record reconciliation. Planetary designation files are reviewed for irregular revisions, unexplained redactions, or repeated cartographic amendments. Worlds with unusually high volumes of sealed addenda, missing compliance audits, or fragmented archival continuity are flagged for secondary review. At this stage, the Necron presence is not identified explicitly. Instead, the planet is categorized under provisional hazard indices citing geological instability, xenotech contamination, or anomalous energy signatures. Documentation procedures prioritize containment of information rather than dissemination. Administratum doctrine treats uncertainty as a destabilizing variable. When reports reference non-imperial structures or unexplained machine activity, these entries are isolated into restricted annexes. Access permissions are elevated incrementally, ensuring that no single clerk or sub-department possesses a complete picture. This compartmentalization is deliberate, designed to prevent pattern recognition outside sanctioned analytical circles. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches Tomb Worlds from a fundamentally different perspective. Where the Administratum perceives disruption to order, the Mechanicus perceives opportunity for comprehension. First impressions recorded by Mechanicus personnel emphasize technological deviation rather than threat. Explorator logs focus on material composition, energy behavior, and structural logic. The absence of recognizable standard template construct lineage is noted immediately, triggering classification under prescribed xenotechnological study. Mechanicus documentation begins with machine-centric observation. Surface or specs readings are catalogued in exhaustive detail, often exceeding practical relevance. Electromagnetic emissions, gravimetric anomalies, and temporal distortions are recorded continuously, even in the absence of active constructs. The persistence of power signatures without decay becomes a focal point of analysis, suggesting systems operating beyond known thermodynamic constraints. Joint Administratum and Mechanicus procedures are formalized only after repeated anomalies resist conventional explanation. At this point, the world is reclassified under restricted exploration protocols. Planetary governors receive amended directives limiting excavation depth, infrastructure expansion, and population growth. These directives are issued without explicit justification, framed instead as compliance with revised safety standards. In many cases, the orders arrive too late to prevent intrusion. The documentation chain becomes increasingly layered. Raw data is filtered through multiple interpretive stages before reaching senior oversight bodies. Explorator field notes are transcribed by Mechanicus scribes trained to omit speculative language. Administratum clerks then abstract these transcriptions into summary reports stripped of technical nuance. What remains is a sanitized representation of risk, sufficient to justify restrictions but insufficient to convey urgency. This procedural dilution is not accidental. It reflects a long-standing institutional tension. The administratum prioritizes continuity of governance. The mechanicus prioritizes acquisition of knowledge. Tomb worlds represent a convergence point where these priorities conflict. Full disclosure risks panic and resource diversion. Suppression risks catastrophic loss. As a result, documentation evolves cautiously, often lagging behind reality by decades. Impressions recorded by senior administratum officials describe tomb worlds as administratively hostile environments. Compliance metrics degrade unpredictably. Local authorities fail audits through no clear negligence. Entire data sectors vanish following system-wide revisions. These failures are interpreted as systemic corruption rather than external interference, reinforcing internal corrective measures rather than investigative escalation. In contrast, mechanicus impressions emphasize coherence. Despite their alien origin, tomb world systems exhibit internal consistency. Power flows follow logical architectures. Structural layouts adhere to repeatable geometric principles. This coherence is unsettling precisely because it contradicts Imperial assumptions of xenos inferiority. Several sealed mechanicus treatises note that tomb world infrastructure displays fewer inefficiencies than equivalent Imperial installations. The procedure for formal tomb world designation is deliberately obfuscated. No single decree announces the classification. Instead, a world accumulates restrictions gradually. Trade routes are rerouted, astropathic traffic is reduced, cartographic priority is downgraded. Eventually, the planet disappears from commonly accessed charts, retained only within restricted archives. By the time the designation is complete, few outside the administratum and mechanicus are aware it ever existed. Field impressions from mechanicus explorators assigned to suspected tomb worlds frequently describe a sense of technological intimidation. While official language avoids emotional attribution, repeated references to non-responsive yet observant systems and infrastructure awaiting stimulus appear across unrelated reports. These phrases are later standardized, stripped of implication, and reissued as neutral descriptors. Administratum procedure mandates that once Necron identification is confirmed through direct engagement, retrospective audits are conducted. These audits attempt to reconstruct the failure points that allowed colonization or exploitation to proceed. Responsibility is distributed across decades of clerical decisions, ensuring no single office bears culpability. The process serves less to assign blame than to reinforce existing procedural inertia. In several documented cases, mechanicus representatives petitioned for extended access following confirmation of Necron presence. These requests cite unparalleled opportunities for technological insight. Administratum responses are typically non-committal, authorizing limited observation while denying direct interference. The resulting compromise satisfies neither party and often collapses once hostilities escalate. The tone of later documentation becomes markedly colder. Language shifts from conditional to deterministic. Phrases such as anticipated reactivation window and probable total biosphere loss replace earlier uncertainty. Even so, dissemination remains constrained. Planetary populations are rarely informed of true risk until evacuation or suppression orders are issued, if at all. One recurring feature of administratum records is the post-loss normalization of tomb worlds. After a planet is abandoned or destroyed, its file is finalized. Addenda cease. Threat indices stabilize. The world becomes static within the archive, its danger acknowledged but no longer active in bureaucratic terms. This finalization contrasts sharply with mechanicus records, which remain open-ended, continually annotated with speculative correlations drawn from other tomb world encounters. Ultimately, the combined impressions of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus reveal a shared limitation. Both institutions are reactive rather than predictive. Their procedures are optimized for known threats, not civilizations operating on geological timescales. documentation becomes an attempt to impose administrative structure onto phenomena that fundamentally disregard it. That establishes that Tomb Worlds challenge not only Imperial military capacity, but its systems of knowledge itself. The Imperium does not fail to recognize danger. It fails to recognize scale. By the time documentation converges on truth, the planet has already moved beyond the point where records can influence outcome. In this way, Tomb Worlds are first defeated on parchment, long before they awaken in metal. Geological analysis of Necron Tomb Worlds represents one of the few areas where Imperial institutions have been able to derive consistent conclusions across multiple encounters. Unlike biological or technological assessments, planetary geology provides measurable, repeatable data resistant to deliberate obfuscation. Even so, the findings consistently indicate manipulation on a scale that exceeds Imperial planetary engineering doctrine. Initial geological surveys of suspected tomb worlds often produce contradictory results. Surface strata conform to expected planetary formation models, yet deeper scans reveal discontinuities incompatible with natural processes. Mantle density readings fluctuate sharply around subterranean regions later confirmed as tomb complexes. In some cases, entire sections of planetary crust appear reinforced, as though layered with artificial material bonded at the molecular level to native rock. Adeptus Mechanicus Geologies teams note that these reinforcement layers do not merely support weight, they redistribute stress dynamically. Seismic events that would normally propagate outward instead collapse inward, dissipated harmlessly through unknown energy absorption mechanisms. This results in planets that exhibit unusually low tectonic activity, despite active stellar systems or gravitational instability within their orbital clusters. Core analytics further complicate classification. Many tomb worlds possess cores that are partially hollowed or displaced. Rather than a molten center, these planets contain vast subcrustal voids stabilized by structural frameworks of necrodermis alloys and force field lattices. These voids house primary necropolis networks, power generation arrays, and transit conduits extending across hemispheres. From an Imperial geological perspective, such voids should render the planet structurally unsound. Instead, tomb worlds demonstrate extreme long-term stability. Mechanicus models suggest that Necron engineering compensates for missing mass by manipulating gravitational vectors internally, maintaining equilibrium without reliance on planetary rotation or molten core convection. These findings remain theoretical, as direct experimentation is prohibited. Mineralogical surveys reveal further anomalies. Tomb worlds often contain unnaturally pure veins of conductive metals, arranged in radial or grid-like patterns beneath the surface. These veins do not align with natural ore deposition models and frequently intersect at precise geometric angles. Analysis indicates that they function as planetary-scale power distribution networks rather than extractable resources. Attempts to mine these veins consistently fail. Equipment degrades rapidly. Cutting tools lose cohesion. Energy drills trigger defensive responses from dormant scarab constructs or automated sealing systems. In some cases, the ore itself destabilizes when removed from its native matrix, disintegrating into inert particulate matter. This behavior suggests that the material's properties depend on integration with tomb world systems, rather than inherent composition. Geological analytics also identify widespread phase instability zones. These regions exhibit inconsistent spatial metrics, causing depth measurements to vary between scans. Such zones are typically located above major tomb access corridors or command nexuses. Imperial theory proposes that these distortions serve both as concealment and as structural buffers, allowing tomb complexes to shift positions slightly in response to planetary stress or intrusion. Strategically, these geological features render tomb worlds exceptionally resilient. Conventional bombardment doctrines rely on crustal fracture, tectonic destabilization, or mantle ignition to achieve planetary denial. Tomb worlds negate these methods. Reinforced strata absorb kinetic impact. Energy dampening fields disperse thermal loads. Void structures prevent shockwave propagation from reaching critical systems. Orbital analytics demonstrate that even sustained cyclonic torpedo strikes often fail to penetrate beyond surface layers. In recorded instances where crustal breach was achieved, exposed tomb infrastructure reconfigured in real time, sealing access points and redistributing internal systems. The planet itself behaves as a defensive platform rather than a passive target. From a strategic value standpoint, tomb worlds occupy positions of disproportionate importance. Many are located along major warp transit corridors or within resource-rich sectors. Others sit at gravitational convergence points, allowing control over multiple neighbouring systems. This placement suggests intentional deployment during the ancient Necron era, anticipating future galactic traffic patterns rather than responding to them. Administratum analysts initially interpreted this distribution as coincidence, attributing it to Imperial expansion bias. However, cross-sector mapping revealed that tomb worlds predate known warp routes yet align closely with modern navigation lanes. This implies predictive capability on a temporal scale the Imperium cannot replicate, reinforcing the view that tomb worlds were positioned with long-term galactic dominance in mind. Control of a tomb world confers several strategic advantages to Necron dynasties. Subterranean shipyards enable rapid deployment of tomb ships without reliance on orbital infrastructure. Planetary pylons provide localized warp interference, disrupting enemy navigation and communication. Energy grids can project shields or weapons across orbital distances, transforming the planet into a system-level bastion. For the Imperium, this same value becomes liability. Worlds once earmarked for fortress development or industrial hubs become unusable once tomb world status is suspected. Entire strategic plans must be rewritten, supply lines rerouted, defensive perimeters extended to compensate for denied space. The cost is not merely local but sector-wide. Geological permanence further enhances strategic leverage. Tomb worlds do not require resupply, reinforcement, or population support. They persist independently of galactic conditions. Even if isolated, they remain operational. This allows Necron forces to conduct wars of attrition measured in centuries, knowing their strongholds will endure long after enemy coalitions fracture. In several suppressed Mechanicus assessments, tomb worlds are described as fixed anchors within Necron grand strategy. Unlike mobile fleets, which can be destroyed or diverted, these planets serve as immutable reference points. Campaigns can be planned around their inevitable reactivation rather than contingent success. Attempts to repurpose tomb worlds for Imperial use have uniformly failed. Geological contamination persists even after Necron withdrawal. Subsurface instability zones interfere with construction. Machine spirits refuse to synchronize with native systems. In some cases, Imperial fortresses built atop neutralized tomb worlds suffered catastrophic collapse decades later when dormant systems reasserted control. Strategic denial thus becomes the only viable Imperial doctrine. Tomb worlds are not assets to be captured but hazards to be isolated. Administratum policy increasingly favors quarantine over confrontation, accepting territorial loss to prevent wider destabilization. This approach, while pragmatic, implicitly acknowledges Necron superiority in planetary-scale warfare. The long-term strategic implication is profound. Each tomb world represents a permanent reduction in Imperial maneuver space. As more awaken, or are identified, the Imperium's effective territory contracts, even if nominal borders remain unchanged. The galaxy becomes increasingly segmented by zones of Necron control or influence. Chapter 2, Part 2 demonstrates that tomb worlds are not merely dangerous locations but foundational elements of Necron strategic architecture. Their geological design ensures endurance, their placement ensures relevance, their resilience ensures denial. Against such constructs, Imperial strategy shifts from dominance to survival. The planet itself ceases to be terrain. It becomes a weapon, fixed in place and waiting. From the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum, Necron tomb worlds are formally classified as net negative assets. This designation is not derived from lack of material value, but from the impossibility of safe extraction, governance, or long-term exploitation. Any discussion of potential resources is therefore framed not in terms of profit, but in terms of theoretical opportunity weighed against guaranteed loss. Administratum projections acknowledge that tomb worlds contain immense quantities of high-value materials. Geological surveys indicate concentrations of exotic metals exceeding those found on standard forge or mining worlds. These include hyperconductive alloys, radiation-resistant composites, and crystalline matrices capable of sustaining energy flows far beyond Imperial tolerances. However, these materials are inseparable from Necron infrastructure. Extraction attempts consistently destabilize surrounding systems, triggering defensive responses or rendering the materials inert. From an administrative standpoint, a resource that cannot be extracted, transported, or tithed is functionally non-existent. As such, tomb worlds are excluded from resource ledgers regardless of theoretical abundance. In several internal reviews, administratum analysts explicitly caution against allowing speculative value to influence policy, citing historical losses incurred by overconfidence in marginal gains. The Adeptus Mechanicus, while acknowledging these risks, frames potential resources differently. To the Mechanicus, the primary resource of a tomb world is not material but informational. Necron technology represents a complete alternative evolutionary path of machine development, unbound by standard template construct constraints. Even fragmentary study promises insights that could elevate Imperial engineering by centuries. Scientific interest focuses on several key domains. Necron power generation systems operate without observable fuel consumption, suggesting closed-loop energy manipulation or direct exploitation of fundamental physical constants. Tomb world stasis fields maintain structural and cognitive integrity across millions of years, far exceeding Mechanicus cryostasis capabilities. Necrodermis exhibits self-repair, adaptive restructuring, and phase-shifting properties unmatched by any known Imperial alloy. However, the benefits of studying these systems are constrained by access limitations. Active tomb worlds are inaccessible by definition. Dormant worlds resist intrusion through automated defenses and environmental manipulation. Even destroyed tomb worlds remain hazardous, their residual systems unstable and poorly understood. Mechanicus doctrine therefore emphasizes passive observation, data correlation, and theoretical modeling over direct experimentation. In rare cases, partial success has been achieved through the recovery of isolated artifacts. These are typically small constructs, damaged components, or residual energy matrices retrieved from battlefields rather than tomb interiors. Even these items pose significant risk. Machine spirits react unpredictably. Data corruption spreads through nearby cogitator systems. Several forge worlds maintain sealed vaults, dedicated solely to containing Necron-derived materials, access to which requires the highest authorization. The scientific benefits derived from such artifacts are incremental rather than transformative. Improved understanding of energy containment, limited advances in material resilience, and marginal refinements in phase field theory represent the upper boundary of confirmed gains. Grand breakthroughs promised by early Mechanicus optimism remain unrealized, constrained by incomplete data and ethical prohibitions enforced by the cult Mechanicus itself. Administratum analysis emphasizes opportunity cost. Every expedition diverted toward tomb world research consumes fleets, personnel, and political capital that could be deployed elsewhere. Given the low probability of actionable return, tomb world exploitation is categorized as strategically inefficient. This assessment underpins the prevailing policy of avoidance and quarantine. The Mechanicus, while officially aligned with this policy, maintains a more nuanced internal position. Within sealed data archives, tomb worlds are described as inevitable future study sites rather than permanent exclusions. The belief persists that eventual comprehension of Necron systems is not a question of possibility but of timing. Human technological evolution is viewed as incomplete, with tomb worlds serving as distant benchmarks rather than immediate objectives. Final analysis from a joint administratum and Mechanicus perspective converges on a single conclusion. Tomb worlds cannot be integrated into the Imperial system of worlds. They resist governance, taxation, habitation, and exploitation. Their value lies neither in conquest nor in colonization, but in the constraints they impose. Administratum policy defines tomb worlds as strategic null zones. They are removed from expansion plans, trade calculations, and demographic forecasting. Their existence forces redirection rather than adaptation. This policy accepts territorial loss as preferable to systemic destabilization. The Adeptus Mechanicus frames tomb worlds as cautionary exemplars. They represent technological culmination achieved without ethical limitation or biological constraint. In internal doctrine, tomb worlds are cited as evidence that mastery over matter and time does not equate to sustainability or harmony. This interpretation allows the Mechanicus to reconcile admiration with prohibition. Both institutions acknowledge a shared vulnerability. Imperial civilization operates on acceleration. Expansion, production, and innovation are driven by short-term necessity. Necron Tomb Worlds operate on endurance. Their timelines render Imperial urgency irrelevant. In this mismatch, the Imperium finds itself strategically disadvantaged despite numerical and territorial scale. This concludes that tomb worlds are not prizes to be seized nor puzzles to be solved, but fixed variables within a hostile equation. The Imperium can study their effects, adapt around their presence, and survive their awakening, but it cannot meaningfully benefit from their existence. In administratum ledgers, tomb worlds are marked as losses before conflict begins. In Mechanicus archives, they are marked as lessons not yet fully understood. Between these positions lies the Imperium's only viable stance: recognition without possession. Inquisitorial impressions of Necron Tomb Worlds diverge sharply from those of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where those institutions emphasize order, resource denial, or technological study, the Inquisition frames tomb worlds as existential aberrations. They are not merely hostile Xenos installations, but violations of assumed cosmic hierarchy. Inquisitorial records rarely begin with material description. They begin with threat evaluation. Early Inquisition awareness of tomb worlds developed indirectly. Fragmented reports of total planetary loss, unexplained compliance collapse, and systematic data erasure drew attention not because of scale, but because of consistency. Entire populations vanished without warp anomalies, demonic signatures, or traceable Xenos occupation. This absence of expected indicators triggered Ordo-Xenos scrutiny long before Necron identification was formally confirmed. Initial impressions recorded by Inquisitors emphasize the unsettling neutrality of tomb worlds. They do not radiate warp corruption. They do not provoke psychic backlash. Astropathic contact remains technically possible until disruption occurs abruptly and without warning. This lack of immaterial resonance places tomb worlds outside standard threat taxonomies, complicating containment doctrine. Field observations compiled by Inquisition agents consistently note environmental wrongness that resists classification. Time perception anomalies are among the most frequently reported. Chronometers desynchronize without mechanical failure. Subjective time reported by operatives conflicts with recorded duration. In several sealed testimonies, agents describe moments of temporal compression, where hours appear to pass within minutes, or vice versa. These effects occur without warp exposure, ruling out conventional causation. Spatial irregularities are similarly documented. Corridors within tomb-adjacent structures alter orientation between surveys. Distances fluctuate marginally but measurably. Inquisitorial cartographers report maps becoming obsolete within days, not due to physical restructuring but due to inconsistent spatial metrics. These distortions remain localized and cease once agents withdraw, suggesting active environmental control rather than instability. Inquisitorial observation places particular emphasis on silence. Tomb worlds do not merely lack sound, they suppress it. Vox transmissions degrade without interference patterns. Ambient noise fails to propagate normally. Acoustic tests reveal sound absorption exceeding known physical limits. This silence persists even during combat, where explosions and weapons discharge register audibly at reduced intensity. The effect contributes to disorientation and impaired threat assessment. One of the most troubling observations concerns Necron behaviour itself. Inquisitors note that Necron forces do not react in ways consistent with purely deterministic machines. Tactical pauses occur at moments that provide no immediate advantage. Units sometimes observe rather than engage, allowing withdrawal where extermination would be simpler. This behaviour is interpreted not as malfunction, but as deliberate restraint, implying objectives beyond immediate territorial control. Unexplainable findings accumulate rapidly once Inquisition presence escalates. Psychic operatives report null zones within Tomb Worlds where psychic activity is neither blocked nor suppressed, but irrelevant. Powers activate without effect. Warp entities fail to manifest despite proper ritual conditions. The Imperium appears disconnected rather than resisted. This phenomenon is unique among known Xenos threats, and remains without satisfactory explanation. Several Inquisition records reference encounters with structures that defy material analysis. Surfaces register as solid yet allow partial penetration under specific energy frequencies. Visual perception disagrees with tactile confirmation. Auspex readings contradict direct observation. In one redacted incident, an Inquisitor physically passed through a sealed wall without triggering alarms or phase shift detection, only for the barrier to reassert itself moments later. Eyewitness testimonies collected under oath frequently describe a sense of observation without presence. Agents report feeling monitored in areas where no active constructs are detected. Surveillance sweeps confirm absence of sensors or energy emissions. The sensation persists even after withdrawal, fading only after significant distance is achieved. While such accounts are treated cautiously, their recurrence across unrelated operations elevates them beyond psychological anomaly. The Inquisition also records instances of causality disruption. Actions taken by operatives appear anticipated by Tomb World systems before execution. Ambushes fail against enemies that have not yet activated. Access points seal moments before arrival. Countermeasures deploy in advance of provocation. These patterns suggest predictive capability based on probabilistic modelling rather than reaction, a concept deeply unsettling to Inquisitorial strategic doctrine. Inquisitors express particular concern regarding information contamination. Data recovered from Tomb Worlds exhibits recursive corruption. Files alter when accessed repeatedly. Transcriptions degrade subtly, replacing precise figures with approximations. Names lose phonetic consistency. Over time, records become less specific rather than more, as though precision itself is being eroded. This effect persists even in isolated, sanctified archives. Several unexplainable findings relate to memory. Operatives returning from Tomb World exposure display minor but consistent recall gaps. These gaps do not align with trauma patterns. They concern insignificant details rather than critical events. The effect is interpreted as selective degradation rather than loss, though mechanism remains unknown. Hypotheses range from low-level temporal manipulation to passive cognitive filtering. Inquisition. Impressions of Tomb Worlds emphasize that these phenomena occur without escalation. There is no warning phase, no threshold event. The world does not become stranger over time. It is already operating beyond Imperial frameworks from the moment of detection. Increased exposure does not clarify understanding but compounds uncertainty. From an Inquisitorial standpoint, the most alarming characteristic of Tomb Worlds is their indifference. They do not respond emotionally, ideologically, or metaphysically. They do not seek conversion, corruption, or domination in the human sense. They persist. This renders traditional Inquisition tools, which rely on identifying motive and belief, largely ineffective. Chapter 3. Part 1 establishes that Tomb Worlds cannot be fully interpreted through material or administrative lenses alone. They introduce phenomena that undermine assumptions about time, space, causality, and the relevance of the Imperium. For the Inquisition, this places Necron Tomb Worlds in a category distinct from all other Xenos threats. They are not enemies that hate, negotiate, or corrupt. They are systems that operate according to principles humanity does not share and cannot meaningfully disrupt. In Inquisition archives, Tomb Worlds are not described as invasions or awakenings. They are described as reassertions. The galaxy does not change when a Tomb World awakens. The galaxy is corrected. Artifacts recovered from Necron Tomb Worlds are catalogued by the Inquisition under the most restrictive classifications available. The defining characteristic of these objects is not their destructive potential, but their incompatibility with Imperial epistemology. They do not simply represent advanced technology. They represent knowledge that resists contextualization within human framework. Inquisitorial artifact records distinguish between items recovered incidentally and those deliberately secured during sanctioned operations. The former include fragments collected from battlefields, collapsed tomb access points, or abandoned surface structures. The latter are rare and usually the result of joint operations involving the Ordo Xenos, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and, in some cases, covert Astartes intervention. Even then, recovery is often accidental rather than intentional. Most recovered artifacts are incomplete. Intact Necron devices rarely remain inert once removed from their native environment. Many degrade, phase shift, or self-neutralize within hours of extraction. Others appear dormant, only to activate unpredictably long after initial containment. Inquisition doctrine treats all Necron artifacts as potentially active regardless of observed behavior. Commonly catalogued items include necrodermis fragments, energy conduits, glyph-encoded plates, and compact constructs of unknown function. Necrodermis samples demonstrate adaptive restructuring even when isolated, rearranging molecular bonds in response to environmental stress. Attempts to stabilize these samples often fail, resulting in either complete disintegration or aggressive reconfiguration that compromises containment units. More complex artifacts include devices believed to be data repositories or control nodes. These objects lack recognizable interfaces. Interaction attempts using cogitators, noospheric links, or psychic probing produce inconsistent results. In several cases, access attempts triggered cascading system failures across unrelated Imperial infrastructure, suggesting that the artifacts operate on principles that extend beyond localized interaction. The Inquisition notes that certain artifacts exhibit contextual activation. They remain inert in laboratory conditions but respond to proximity with other Necron materials or specific environmental parameters. This behavior complicates long-term storage, as activation conditions cannot be reliably predicted or suppressed. Particularly concerning are artifacts associated with Tomb World command structures. These include fragments believed to originate from cryptech laboratories, dynastic control matrices, or tomb nexus chambers. While incomplete, these items often retain residual authority signatures. Mechanicus analysis suggests they were once components of planetary-scale systems rather than standalone devices. Their presence outside a tomb world is therefore anomalous by design. Knowledge derived from artifact study is subject to aggressive censorship. The Inquisition maintains multiple parallel classification schemes to ensure that no single archive contains a complete understanding of any given artifact. Technical data is separated from observational data. Behavioral analysis is divorced from material composition. Cross-referencing is restricted to inquisitors holding convergent clearance across multiple ordos. This compartmentalization serves a specific purpose. Inquisitorial doctrine holds that understanding Necron technology too completely risks replicating its underlying assumptions. These assumptions, while not overtly heretical, undermine foundational Imperial beliefs regarding causality, linear time, and the primacy of the Imperium. As such, knowledge suppression is treated as a defensive act rather than an admission of failure. Several classes of knowledge are automatically censored upon discovery. Any data suggesting manipulation of time at non-warp scales is sealed indefinitely. Findings indicating artificial nullification or irrelevance of the Imperium are restricted to Ordo Xenos High Councils. Evidence that Necron systems predict rather than react to events is flagged as cognitively destabilizing and withheld from broader dissemination. Inquisition records indicate that censorship is not limited to data. Personnel involved in artifact study are often reassigned, mind-scrubbed, or terminated depending on exposure level. This is not punitive, it is preventative. The risk assessed is not corruption, but reorientation of thought. Individuals who begin to conceptualize reality in Necron-aligned terms demonstrate reduced doctrinal reliability and increased strategic deviation. Artifacts deemed too dangerous to destroy are stored in sealed vaults under constant surveillance. These vaults are deliberately isolated from warp routes, population centers, and major data nexuses. Access protocols change periodically to prevent pattern exploitation. In several recorded cases, vaults were deliberately abandoned after subtle internal reconfiguration suggested external influence despite no detected breach. Destruction of Necron artifacts is rare and inconsistently successful. Some devices resist annihilation entirely, reconstituting after physical destruction or dispersing into unrecoverable phase states. Others trigger localized spatial collapse or temporal distortion upon attempted disposal. As a result, indefinite containment is often preferred over destruction. The Inquisition also censors absence. Entire expeditions vanish from the record without notation. Planetary encounters are reclassified as natural disasters, warp storms, or administrative errors. This suppression extends to cartography, astropathic transcripts, and ecclesiarchal sermons. The goal is not deception of the informed, but insulation of the uninformed. One recurring concern within Inquisition archives is the gradual normalization of Necron artifacts through repeated exposure. As more fragments are recovered, their presence risks becoming administratively routine. The Inquisition actively resists this by enforcing scarcity of access and fragmentation of knowledge. Familiarity is treated as vulnerability. Inquisitorial analysis concludes that Necron artifacts do not merely contain dangerous information, they embody it. Their design encodes assumptions about reality that conflict with Imperial cosmology. To study them deeply is to risk adopting those assumptions, consciously or otherwise. Chapter 3, Part 2, establishes that the greatest threat posed by Necron Tomb Worlds is not annihilation, but comprehension. Artifacts offer answers, but those answers destabilize the frameworks that allow the Imperium to function. Knowledge, in this context, is not power but exposure. The Inquisition therefore acts not as a seeker of truth, but as a regulator of it. What is known is limited not by capability, but by necessity. Some artifacts remain locked away, others are lost deliberately, a few are quietly returned to the worlds from which they were taken. This is not mercy, it is containment. Pict feed records associated with Necron Tomb Worlds form one of the most heavily redacted collections within Inquisition archives. Unlike Administratum or Mechanicus imagery, these feeds are not preserved for reference or study. They are preserved as evidence of failure. Most are fragmentary, degraded, or deliberately truncated. Continuous footage is exceptionally rare, and when it exists, it is often classified beyond standard Ordo Xenos clearance. The earliest Pict feeds typically originate from civilian or planetary survey equipment. Orbital Auspex arrays capture static images of surface features that appear unchanged between scans taken years apart. Shadows do not shift according to stellar position. Atmospheric movement is absent despite recorded wind speeds. In some sequences, surface structures appear between frames without evidence of construction or emergence, suggesting either temporal emission or perceptual filtering within the recording systems. As Tomb World activity escalates, Pict feeds degrade rapidly. Visual static intrudes without electromagnetic cause. Frame rates fluctuate independently of recording hardware. Color values drift toward monochrome, often biased toward green spectrum wavelengths. In several archived instances, Pict feeds record imagery that cannot be correlated with physical orientation, showing interior structures while sensors remain external. Combat-related Pict feeds are among the most disturbing. Necron units appear partially desynchronized from the environment, advancing without motion, blur, or transitional frames. Energy discharges register visually, but fail to illuminate surroundings. Imperial forces are observed collapsing without visible injury, their forms destabilizing briefly before disappearing entirely from frame. These disappearances are not accompanied by energy spikes or warp signatures. In some feeds, Necron constructs are visible only intermittently, appearing for single frames before vanishing. Playback at reduced speed confirms their presence was recorded, not perceived. This intermittent visibility undermines target acquisition and contributes to battlefield confusion documented in associated Vox logs. Eyewitness testimonials collected by the Inquisition are treated with caution, but reveal consistent thematic elements. Survivors describe the environment as resistant to interpretation. Distances feel inaccurate. Structures appear closer or farther than they are. Several witnesses report attempting to reach visible landmarks, only to find themselves redirected without conscious awareness of deviation. A recurring testimonial element involves motion without approach. Necron forces advance steadily, yet never seem to close distance until they are suddenly within immediate proximity. This effect is reported across multiple worlds and operational contexts, suggesting manipulation of perception rather than movement speed. Witnesses frequently comment on the absence of hostility as traditionally understood. Necron units do not shout, gesture, or display emotional cues. There is no sense of pursuit or urgency. Engagement feels procedural. Survivors describe being processed rather than attacked. Those allowed to retreat are not chased, reinforcing Inquisition concerns that extermination is not always the immediate objective. Several eyewitnesses report observing Necron constructs cease combat operations abruptly, withdrawing underground without apparent reason. These withdrawals often occur while Imperial forces are vulnerable, contradicting tactical logic. Inquisitorial analysis interprets this behavior as adherence to long-term operational thresholds rather than battlefield opportunity. More troubling testimonials involve experiences that cannot be externally verified. Individuals describe moments of spatial dislocation, emerging from structures they did not enter or traversing distances without memory of transit. Others recount hearing voices not through sound, but through implication, describing conclusions rather than commands. These accounts are recorded then sealed, as they do not align with known psychic phenomena. Astropaths present during Tomb World incidents offer limited but significant testimony. Many report that the warp does not recede or resist within Tomb World proximity. It becomes irrelevant. Attempts to reach into the Imperium produce no feedback, positive or negative. The connection does not fail. It simply yields nothing. This absence is described as more disturbing than warp turbulence or null fields. Final Inquisition analysis integrates these reports into a unified assessment. Tomb Worlds are not merely sites of Necron presence. They are environments where Imperial interpretive frameworks cease to function reliably. Sight, sound, time, causality, and intent cannot be assumed. This renders conventional threat response models inadequate. From the Inquisition perspective, Tomb Worlds represent a category of threat that does not escalate in response to resistance. They do not adapt visibly. They do not react emotionally. They execute predetermined processes until conditions change. This lack of feedback denies the Imperium its usual means of influence. The final determination within Inquisition archives is not one of imminent extinction, but of asymmetry. Humanity operates within linear urgency. The Necrons operate within deferred certainty. Tomb Worlds do not need to win conflicts. They need only persist until opposition exhausts itself. Accordingly, Inquisition policy regarding Tomb Worlds emphasizes three principles: observation without immersion, containment without engagement, erasure without denial. Worlds are quarantined, records are fragmented, knowledge is limited not because it is false, but because it is destabilizing. In closing assessments, Inquisitors do not speculate on Necron intent beyond necessity. Motivation is deemed irrelevant. Tomb Worlds exist. They function. They reassert control when disturbed. That is sufficient. The final thoughts recorded within Ordo Xenos conclaves do not frame Tomb Worlds as invaders. They are described as corrections within a system humanity briefly assumed was its own. The galaxy does not resist them, it accommodates them. A Tomb World awakening is not an event that changes the future, it restores an older one.